The owners of a Winston Churchill-themed cafe in London probably didn't think they were doing anything out of the ordinary. But in times such as these, even considering Churchill a war hero is apparently controversial. To my embarrassment, 14 members of my old university, SOAS, held a protest demanding the owner apologise for aggrandising the wartime leader rather than portraying him as a racist. The demonstrators faced a backlash, but their student union backed them, saying that the cafe, quote, exercises a concerted historical amnesia of British colonialism, offensive to those who continue to experience institutional racism. Not to me and thousands like me, it doesn't. Of course, Churchill was flawed, just as Gandhi and all great historical leaders were. But their more troublesome ideas were relatively banal during the times that they lived in, and their achievements outshine their shortcomings. These two criteria must surely apply, otherwise no historical figure is safe from being torn down. The arrogance of presentism, judging historical figures by today's morality, that is dangerous and ignores the true complexity of human nature. I mean, Churchill defeated Hitler, for goodness sake. If we can't celebrate him, who can we celebrate?
Maajid, I'm going to start by asking you a question.
Please do.
Do you think we in Britain today have a healthy and honest relationship with our history?
No, I don't. And I'll give you one example. I studied history at A-level, and I studied what I was taught was the Indian Mutiny. Now, I don't think that was a mutiny. By the way, my origins are South Asian. My father immigrated from Pakistan. I think it was a rebellion against colonialism, but it's still called a mutiny, somehow indicating it's wrong. But, you know, that's not the point. What we're not talking about here, Afua, is a robust and healthy debate about the merits and the demerits of historical figures like Churchill. What I'm raising is the fact that these students stormed a cafe and refused to leave and were somehow oblivious to the fact that every great historical leader, not just Churchill, but Gandhi, Mandela, they will all, if we subjected them to this sort of lens where we started protesting that you know, we don't open cafes in their names, we'll have nothing and nobody left to celebrate in history.
See, I think you and these students actually have more in common than you realise.
Oh, yeah, we both went to SOAS, that's true, yeah.
And there's that.
And I was a student union officer there.
I think you actually have a lot more in common than I realised.
Yeah.
Because the reason, and I'm not part of their movement, but the reason that I think they're doing this and the reason that I can relate to them doing it is their frustration that what you said we should have, which is a healthy and robust relationship with history, is not being had. You talked about the complexity of historical figures. Most British people do not know Churchill as a complex human being. They know him as a one-dimensional, simplistic historical figure, i.e. a wartime hero, which he was. I am not going to sit here and say that I'm not glad that Churchill was able to defeat Nazism. You know, my own family suffered directly from Nazism as German Jews, so it's not that I am
insulting to suggest that people don't know the history of this country and they don't know the history of Churchill.
No, it's not an insult to them. It's because we don't tell them the truth. It's not recorded. It's not evident in public spaces. It's not in the school curriculum.
His bigotries were recorded. They were a matter of record.
And do you think they are part of the popular understanding of who he was as a complex person?
You have to understand there are people for our time, and yes, some of his views were horrendous, but his pettiness and his bigotries were nowhere near as horrendous as the horrors that were unleashed by Hitler. And he was a man of our time. And people are forgetting, it's easy to forget how close we came to surrendering to Hitler. A lot of politicians in this country wanted to do it. A lot of the aristocrats in this country wanted to do it. And he saw the evil, let me finish, he saw the evils of Nazism long before the rest of Europe did.
Can I say that you know, I don't think, to be honest, taking on board your point that there isn't an awareness of the merits and the demerits of any great historical figure, but something tells me these students wouldn't storm the Gandhi statue in Bloomsbury and try and protest that being there, despite the fact that Gandhi was also had racist views, as you know, Afua.
I think it's interesting you raise that, because I think you're making assumptions. There are many Africans, for example, who in Ghana, which is my mother's country, they've removed the statue of Gandhi because but there is growing awareness. Not just this isn't about picking British heroes and demolishing. This is about saying. Let me finish, Phil. I want to bring you in.
I want a bacon sandwich. Seriously, that's all I want is a bacon sandwich. And if I want to have it in a place that chooses... right now, yeah, honestly.
No, right.
Yeah, and if I want to do it in a place that wants to celebrate a man who took this country by the mantle and led us to victory in a war that was overwhelming odds that we were going to lose, then that's where I'll have my sandwich.
with
Do you know
all
what I
due
mean?
respect,
I know would Ada walk in
Phil,
there and say anything about these
with all due
people.
respect, Phil,
Unbelievable.
with all due respect,
Phil, they have no right to intimidate people.
With all
when they
due
do.
respect, Phil, it's easy for you to say that. If you were of Bengali descent, for example, there are many people
Were
who
there people
feel
there of Bengali descent?
personally hurt by the legacy of that famine. Carol, you said
That's
you
fine, but
used
last
the
time I
word
just-
pettiness. Carol used the word pettiness.
I said pettiness,
This is
petty
3
bigotry.
million people who died in an avoidable, preventable
2.1
famine,
million.
which Churchill could have prevented,
Okay.
and instead he diverted aid away from it and exported food from India to British troops. That is not
I do
petty.
want to say that is 2.1 million people died, and there is a historical debate as to exactly what role Churchill played in it, but it's a debate. And actually, none of those students were of South Asian origin. In fact, no one around this table apart from me is, and I'm not offended at the Churchill Cafe.
But are you
Those
not
students,
glad
hold on, Carol. Those students were offended on my behalf, and I find that
on your behalf.
It is. Hang on,
This
I'm
is on
South
behalf
Asian.
of truth. No,
I'm
it's
South
not.
Asian.
It's
right?
not that you have a monopoly on the truth.
No,
because
but
of your
that's not
heritage.
what
We're supposed to hide this
Hold on,
history?
hold on.
No, exactly. I want us to talk about
they
it.
Were claiming,
This is what I think
they
we
were
should be
claiming
doing.
people like me. That's the exact quote of the protesters. Were
And they were
claiming
also
people-
claiming
Hold-
Churchill.
I've got the
They were
exact
also
quote.
claiming
Hold on.
Churchill was a Nazi
I've
as
got
well.
the exact quote of the protesters, and I'm going to read it.
Right.
The SOAS Students'
Yes.
Union said, "This cafe exercises a concerted historical amnesia of British colonialism, which is offensive to those who continue to experience institutional
Right,
racism."
my point. They were claiming offence on my behalf
They were
because
claiming
I continue
offence on
to
behalf of
experience
everyone who experienced
No, but that's why
institutional
not just
racism.
everyone, but specifically you mentioned the famine, so I'm going to say specifically South Asia, and that's me, right? And I'm saying none of those students were from South Asia. In fact, the leader of was originally Somali, and I think actually to claim offence, to speak as if we all think the same way about this is actually quite offensive. I just want to, before Nick comes in, I think we need to go
I
to
would
the
be
cafe
thrilled
owner.
if someone like
Yeah.
Nick, for example, were to own one of these issues as somebody who's interested in Britishness as an identity
So Nick,
that can
before you do,
encompass truth.
the cafe owner has something to say about this. I think we should hear from. Just read. I'm going to read what he said, and then Nick, of course, you can come in and say something too. But Chris Evans, who's the cafe, not that Chris Evans, but this Chris Evans, he says if you cannot celebrate Britain and Great Britain's, you're just erasing history. And if you cannot celebrate Churchill, you cannot celebrate anyone. I'd say to the protesters, come in, have a cup of tea, let's have a debate about it. Because if what you're saying is that we cannot celebrate these leaders, does that mean that we cannot celebrate any human being ever? Nick?
I think the clue is in the name. It's called the Blighty Cafe. You probably know what you're going to get when you go there. Afua, you're a very, very smart woman. I worry that you think that your interpretation of history is in some way superior to other people's, or that is the one that we should all sign up to. And ultimately, there will be no one. Mother Teresa, I'm sure we can probably find that she never returned a library book if we work long and hard enough. There will be some reason.
Are you comparing not returning a library book to a famine in which
come on, that was a lie.
Just checking.
But just another recent one which I want to bring in and put before the court is Gladstone, William Gladstone. His students up in Liverpool University now want his name removed from one of the buildings up there. They say his career was funded by his father, Sir John Gladstone. That, in turn, was built on the back of the slave trade. So the student body says it should be named after one of the people who attended there. So they suggest it be called the John Snow Hall, as in the newsreader. That is the path down which we are treading. Yeah. It's a bit like Zulu, which is a glorious testament to British heroism. We are supporting and praising and celebrating a tremendous British hero. Exactly. That's what we're doing.
So I have a killer question. Figuratively, of course.
Yes.
Not to be endorsing colonialism.
Not with him at the table. With the killer question. I mean, rather.
Well, here's my question, and that is that, if we're not comfortable with Churchill, I presume Gandhi would come under the same kind of criticism. Who should we celebrate from history? Who is, by the way, fits that criteria that you've put forward that hasn't got any of their kind of
I think the problem is in the question, right? As soon as you take a celebratory approach to history, you're already running into trouble because, like we're all saying,
So we win a
people are
battle.
complex.
No,
Carol, when you decide, as our successively desire, David Cameron, Gordon Brown, Michael Gove, that we should celebrate the great history of these islands, you're telling me you don't want to acknowledge that we basically helped design and perpetrate the slave trade for 400 years, that we colonised the world on a white supremacist ideology, that we have people that who we hold in high esteem.
So we shouldn't celebrate Darwin?
I think that we should look at people
Darwin?
in a broad context.
Plato? Aristotle?
And we should ask questions. Where's our intellectual curiosity? Where's our interest in
With respect, I'm just wondering which historical figure.
Because of Churchill.
Let's remember that.
Okay,
We do.
I know we want to move on, but just very quick, is there any historical figure you want to celebrate? Just very quickly.
I personally am not comfortable comfortable with the celebratory approach to issues. So take, for
no.
example,
I'm trying to
Kwame
get to
Nkrumah, who I really look up to, Ghana's independence leader, a flawed man. You know, he ended up basically
So no,
running a
the answer's
dictatorship.
no, you don't.
But I still think there's lots to celebrate in history. And I bet many British people haven't heard of him, despite the fact he played a fundamental role in shaping Britain's 20th century history.
So you done?
So there is a lot that most of us don't know. It's not because I have a superior understanding of history, Nick. It's just that I'm interested, and a lot of people don't seem to be.
I just feel sorry for the people in the cafe who went for a bit of breakfast.
Exactly.
And they got all that
History for
nonsense.
colleges,
I bet they learned.
sandwiches for